The trial of the crew of the Saladin was a celebrated pirate trial long after the end of the Golden Age of Piracy. The tale of greed, betrayal, murder, and the huge amount of money that had inspired such acts was enough to grip the public imagination for years to come.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. We're looking for Murderous Piracy on the Saladin.
Here we are. Enjoy!
Captain Cunningham of the Billows looked around himself with suspicion. He had been alerted to the stranded vessel by two of his men, who he had sent to fetch water near Country Harbor, Nova Scotia. On going to investigate the stranded ship, he had found a barque with a piece of tarred canvas and a board nailed over the stern to prevent anyone from identifying the ship by her name. Once on board, there had been even more worrying things. There were only 6 sailors on board. All of them had clearly been drinking, and the entire ship was in disarray, including chests that had been broken open. On asking where the officers of the ship were, the sailors had told Captain Cunningham a very unlikely story. Their captain, they said, had been sick and died at sea, while the mate had been washed overboard. Worse yet, the last entry in the ship's log was for April 14th, 1844, and it was now May 21st. Captain Cunningham failed to be convinced. He sent 2 of his men to Guysborough for a magistrate to arrive and take charge of the ship. With the assistance of Captain Cunningham and several fishermen, most of the valuable cargo on the ship was quickly seized. Captain Cunningham was not done yet, though, and he also reached out to the judge of the Vice Admiralty. A warrant was soon issued for the 6 sailors who had been found on board the mysterious ship. The only problem was the sailors were nowhere to be seen. The story of how the Saladin ended up stranded on the coast of Nova Scotia actually began with a different ship by the name of the Vitula, under the command of Captain Fielding. Like the Saladin, the Vitula was a British ship that engaged in trade with South America. Captain Fielding was disappointed when he arrived in Buenos Aires. He could not find a cargo, and he had tried Valparaiso, but was just as empty-handed when he left there. Having failed to find a cargo twice, Captain Fielding came up with a new and less legal means of finding business. He sailed for the Chincha Islands, intending to steal some guano, which belonged to the Peruvian government, and smuggle it out of South America. Unfortunately for him, the Peruvian government caught wind of his scheme, and they sent soldiers to capture him. Captain Fielding had a reputation as a bully, and his crew did not have any love for him. So, when the authorities showed up, they refused to fight by their captain's side. In spite of this, Captain Fielding did try to resist until he was shot in the shoulder. A serious enough wound that rather than imprisoning him, the soldiers first brought him to a hospital to recover before he was taken to Callao and imprisoned. As for the Vitula, the Peruvian courts condemned the ship for being engaged in smuggling and sold her. Captain Fielding now had a multitude of problems. He was in jail, wounded, and since the ship he lost was not his own, likely to soon be in trouble with the ship's owners as well. Not willing to learn what consequence of his actions were going to be, Captain Fielding escaped the jail with the assistance of his 14-year-old son, and fled back to Valparaiso. From there, he hoped he would be able to find a passage home. But since he had no money, and a very poor reputation, the first 2 ships he asked, the Jeremiah Garnet and the Belfast, both refused. He had better luck when he asked the Saladin for passage. If nothing else, her captain, Captain Mackenzie, had as poor of a reputation as Captain Fielding. he agreed to bring Captain Fielding and his son with him to London, free of charge. The two captains began to fight almost as soon as the voyage began, though the reason for their falling out was never reported. Author Archibald MacMecan would later suggest that it was possible that the two men were simply too alike to get along well, though it is just as possible that it was greed and jealousy that motivated Captain Fielding from the start. He had lost everything in his adventure in Peru, and it was not likely to find himself in command of another ship once word got out about him losing the Vetula. The Saladin was carrying a cargo that must have been an incredible temptation for a man who had already shown himself to be unscrupulous, like Captain Fielding. Not only was she loaded with a guano cargo, like the one he had failed to get his hands on, but she also carried a large amount of copper, 13 150-pound bars of silver, and a chest of gold dollars. After the ship rounded Cape Horn, Captain Fielding decided to make his dreams of taking the ship from Captain Mackenzie a reality. The first person that Captain Fielding approached with his plot to take the ship was the ship's sailmaker, George Jones. Jones had a peg leg, and this excused him from standing a watch, giving him more flexibility to come and go on deck as he pleased. The ship was divided into 2 watches, and Captain Fielding decided who was going to be on his side by their watches, carefully wooing the men who were part of the first mate's watch over to his side, and ignoring the men who were part of the second watch. The conspirators all agreed that the officers would all have to go overboard. Soon, Captain Fielding had 3 sailors, Johnston, Hazelton, and Anderson, all in agreement to join his plan to take the ship in addition to Jones. It was later observed that all of the men who Captain Fielding chose were young, with the oldest being 23, and they all seemed to have been easy to manipulate by Captain Fielding. The night of 13th of April, the conspirators put their plan into action. The mate was not feeling well, and though he was in charge of the watch, he stretched himself on top of the chicken coop to rest, which gave Johnston and Anderson a chance to ambush him with axes. The mate was quickly thrown overboard. They intended to target the captain next, but he had a dog the crew was frightened of. So instead, they called the carpenter, who also acted as a second mate, to the deck. He followed the first mate overboard, but in spite of several blows he was struck by a hammer, he was still awake enough to shout murder as he went overboard. Rather than treating this as a risk to their plan, Captain Fielding took this as a chance to bring Captain Mackenzie to the deck, and he began to shout, "Man overboard!" Captain Mackenzie rushed to the deck and was ambushed in the same way, and also went over the side of the ship. They next ambushed the men of the second watch as they came up to relieve them, and 3 more of the men on board the ship followed after their officers into the sea. It was later said that Anderson took the main part of this bloody work, assisted by Johnston and Captain Fielding. Captain Fielding now felt bold enough to announce himself the captain of the Saladin to his son, who joined him on deck. Jones would later say that the only thing that Captain Fielding's son expressed regret in was that he had missed his chance to strike a blow on Captain Mackenzie. There remained what to do with the cook and the ship's steward, who were both still asleep in spite of what occurred on deck. When asked what to do with the 2 oblivious men, Captain Fielding said that the others could leave this matter to him. Since he had poison, he could give them once they had brought the ship closer to shore. For now, the killing was over. When the cook, a man named Carr, came on deck the next morning and discovered what had happened, he initially said that he would rather join the men who had already gone overboard. But after the crew protested that they did not want any more bloodshed, and Captain Fielding assured him that he only needed to carry out his usual duties, Carr agreed to continue on the ship. Next came the steward, a 19-year-old named Galloway. There are mixed reports about Galloway's feelings on what had just occurred on the ship. Jones and Hazelton said that he also expressed regret that he had not been allowed to join in the murder of the captain. But Johnston said that Galloway was terrified and went along with the men out of fear. Either way, Galloway was also allowed to remain on the ship. The 6 men, literally half of the men who had started the voyage from South America, swore an oath of brotherhood on a Bible that Sunday and threw all of the weapons overboard just in case any of them should be tempted to betray the others out of greed. By Tuesday evening, all was not well on the ship again, though. Oath of brotherhood or not, there was very little trust between the men who had committed such a violent crime out of greed. Captain Fielding was treated with particular suspicion by the crew, since he was the one who had instigated everything. It was observed by the crew that while Captain Fielding had locked up all of the alcohol on the ship, he himself was getting drunk, and when they found hidden weapons on board the ship as well, the crew suspected treachery. Matters were not helped when Anderson told the others that Captain Fielding had suggested to him that they should kill Jones, Carr, Galloway, and Johnston, since he thought they were conspiring against him. Captain Fielding denied any knowledge of the hidden weapons, and they were thrown overboard. But when a carving knife that had gone missing was found hidden, the crew dragged Captain Fielding onto the deck and had a debate about what to do with him. Again, there are differing accounts of what happened next, depending on whose confession is accepted. Johnston said that Carr and Galloway were told that they had to throw Captain Fielding overboard since they had not participated in the original crime and might betray the others once they reached land, while Jones and Hazelton would describe Carr and Galloway as the ones who most advocated for Captain Fielding to be removed from the ship. Jones also added that once Captain Fielding had drowned, Carr and Galloway, without telling anyone of their intention, also threw his son into the ocean after him. With no more officers on board at all, the sailors who remained seemed to have allowed themselves to do whatever they pleased. They had no use for the copper on board, and threw some of it into the sea to lighten the ship. They broke into the alcohol that Captain Fielding had denied them, and soon spent most of their time drunk. No one bothered to pay much attention to where the ship was going. Galloway was placed in charge of navigation as the one who had the most education, since he was the son of a bookseller. Though Galloway knew a little about navigation, he was by no means at a level where he should have found himself in command of navigating a ship on his own. But the crew had intended to sail the ship to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and scuttle it to hide the evidence. They would wreck about 500 miles from their destination on an island that still has a cape named Saladin Point. On the morning of the 22nd of May, with all of her sails to the wind, the Saladin drove hard onto the island and became a total wreck. Though the crew tried to flee when they suspected that their crime had been discovered, they did not make it far before they were arrested. The silver, copper, gold, and bills that were still on the ship were seized and held in the Bank of Nova Scotia, where they were valued at £18,000 at the time, more than enough to have proven a murderous temptation for the men who had sailed on board of the Saladin. At first, the arrested crew who had been transported to Halifax for further questioning under the Vice Admiralty Court stuck to their story that their captain and first mate had both met with misadventure on the high seas, and that nothing criminal had taken place. Inquiries were sent to Valparaiso, but while waiting on these, the 6 men continued to be interviewed. On interviewing the 6 men separately, the judge of the Vice Admiralty could not help but notice that none of their stories matched. He suspected piracy and murder, but putting the men on trial was difficult. The regular courts and the Vice Admiralty Court did not have jurisdiction over things that happened on the high seas away from Nova Scotia. The men of the Saladin were going to have to be tried under the authority of the Special Admiralty Sessions. This required a tribunal of 3 judges to sit on the matter, though the choice of judges was a controversial one. The judge of the Vice Admiralty Court attempted to take charge, but was ousted when the council decided that 3 common law judges would hear the matter instead. Before the grand jury could even hear the facts, Galloway and Carr had already confessed what had happened on board the Saladin, and so they were not in front of the jury when the other 4 of the crew pleaded not guilty. All 4 men admitted to what had taken place on the Saladin, but they also claimed that they had been threatened into the crime by Captain Fielding. It was not an argument that held much sway with the jury, who came back after only 15 minutes, finding the 4 men guilty of piracy. They were about to stand trial for the murder of Captain Mackenzie next, but the 4 men instead decided to withdraw their not guilty pleas and change their pleas to guilty. With this matter taken care of, the jury was now asked to hear the case of Carr and Galloway for the murder of Captain Fielding and his son. This was a murkier case. The cook and steward only had their own confessions as evidence against them, and their lawyer argued that the 2 had been acting in self-preservation and could not be held responsible for their part in the crimes that had taken place. The first jury was unable to decide the matter, but a freshly empaneled jury found both men not guilty. Due to the change in pleas of the 4 men who had already been found guilty, the charge of piracy was dropped, and they were sentenced to hang only for murder in order to spare them the final fate of being hung in chains after death. Up until his sentence was carried out, though Jones would write a detailed confession, he would insist he had not played any role in the death of Captain Fielding's son. We will never know exactly what happened on board the Saladin before it was found off the coast of Nova Scotia. The spot where the 4 men were executed is now part of the grounds of Victoria General Hospital. It was reported by the Herald of Yarmouth that Carr and Galloway returned to England, but another version of their fate was also told. Galloway disappeared quickly, and no one knows what happened to him in his later life. But it was claimed that Carr settled in Digby County, where he lived a peaceful life, except that he was known to drown himself in liquor on the 13th of April every year. The Saladin was the last of the piracy admiralty sessions to be held in Nova Scotia, and is considered one of the last great pirate trials of Canada. The incident captured the public imagination and was preserved in song, while pieces associated with the trial were displayed in museums. Rumors of buried treasure were discussed. Wasn't it possible that the men might have buried some of the money that they had killed for to keep it safe? Nothing of the sort was ever found, and the Saladin herself was slowly broken apart, both by time and salvage, until nothing was left except her name on the point of land that had been her final indignity.
For the confession of George Jones, please see the Quebec Gazette from the 29th of July, 1844, and for more information on the case of the Saladin, please see our sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.